everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be time for another Buy Day. And today, Olivia, we're going to talk about famous American aviators from the early days of aviation in the United States and the books they wrote. Why? Well, because I was just at a book sale up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It was organized by the American Association of University Women. It was a wonderful sale, and in their rare book room, they had this book, which I immediately bought because I found it interesting and took back here to the Scholar, where we will be listing it today. And it is a book written by the most famous, first really a great flying ace for America, and that was Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. Let's get you the title page here of his book called Fighting the Flying Circus. There's Rickenbacker in all of his glory. Now, Rickenbacker was a World War I flying ace for the United States. And do you know how you became an ace? Do you know this? You've heard the term ace. You know the most famous ace, right? The German Red Baron was a great ace. But it took shooting down 5 enemy planes in active combat to become an ace. And one of the interesting things about this book is it has Rickenbacker's complete list of his aerial battles and describes each of them in the book with great detail. And he shot down a lot more than 5 planes. He was extraordinarily famous. He came back from World War I, really a war hero. And at the time, as a celebrity, you had an option to sort of make money if you wanted by writing a celebrity book. And he wrote this book, Fighting the Flying Circus, and he got paid. Do you know how much money he made for this book, Olivia? $25,000. And, in the very early 1920s, $25,000 was a lot of money. It was the same amount of money which a New York hotel magnate put up, I think that same year, like 1919, as a prize for whoever would be the first person to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. $25,000 converted in today's money is a tremendous amount of money, and Rickenbacker made that. He could have made even more, but he didn't really want to go into movies. He was a serious individual. He wanted to write this book. And he did go on a speaking tour for the book, and he signed a lot of them, and that's why I bought this one, because look at that great inscription there. Probably at one of his book signings for the speaking tour, with every best wishes, Captain Rickenbacker. Now, have you heard of Eddie Rickenbacker? No. Okay. But have you heard the name Rickenbacker? Does this ring a bell? Well, you may know Rickenbacker because of a style of guitar. There's a guitar called the Rickenbacker. That was a cousin of Eddie Rickenbacker's, using Eddie Rickenbacker's name to sell his guitar. And today that lives on, maybe even more than Eddie Rickenbacker's name. But there was another famous flying circus. At least I'm a big fan of Monty Python's Flying Circus. And one of the things I like about this book is that there is a graph in here which I think basically explains the origin of Monty Python's name. Did you know this story? Well, the Flying Circus was suggested to Monty Python by a BBC executive. And then Monty Python themselves came up with, I think it was Eric Idle came up with, let's call it Monty Python's Flying Circus, based on a sort of military reference. But the Flying Circus, basically, Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Jones, Terry Gilliam, all of these efforts reminded them of basically the organizational chart that you see here in the Eddie Rickenbacker book. A bit like a Flying Circus dogfight, utter chaos. So to the BBC executives, this was the organizational philosophy of Monty Python's TV show. Monty Python embraced that, of course, because they agreed. And they became known as Monty Python's Flying Circus. But the original Flying Circus was the Red Baron's Flying Circus, and it was named after the brightly colored airplanes, these biplanes of World War I. And then Eddie Rickenbacker adopted the circus term for his squadron as well. So the first great aviation hero in American history, Eddie Rickenbacker, not as well known today. After the war, he became a executive for an airlines company, and he is also famous because in World War II, he was called out of retirement by President Roosevelt to go to the Pacific Theater and deliver a stern message to General McCarthy. It was an oral message. It wasn't written down. Rickenbacker had to remember the message. So we don't know exactly what it said, but it was probably something related to the fact that MacArthur needed to evacuate the Philippines and, follow orders. But before Rickenbacker could deliver that message, his plane, which he wasn't piloting at that time, crash landed into the Pacific Ocean, and he was at sea in a life raft with several other survivors for over 3 weeks in 1942. He lost dozens and dozens of pounds. He was forced to try and eat some fish. He had starvation and dehydration, and he came back even more of a hero in the middle of the war because he was rescued and saved. But that is the story of Eddie Rickenbacker. Now, Rickenbacker inspired another great aviator whose works have recently come into the Scholar. Now, this one you've heard of, and that is Charles Lindbergh. Now, I told you that Charles Lindbergh was motivated by having to, buy this prize that the hotel magnate in New York set up, $25,000. That was a lot of money, the same amount of money that Rickenbacker made for this book. And he got together with other engineers in St. Louis, and he developed an aircraft that could hold an enormous amount of fuel that would be required to make this journey. And he was going to fly solo, and did fly solo in his airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Lindbergh became an aviator in the 1920s, inspired by Rickenbacker, but without the ability to become an ace because there was no war. So he was in the Air Force Reserve, but that didn't do a lot in the 1920s. So he was basically trained as an airplane pilot, delivering airmail, some of the first airmail, and also doing barnstorming tours of America, where he would parachute out of planes and all sorts of other things. But he was convinced he could fly nonstop. And he did. He successfully did this in May of 1927, almost 100 years ago this month. And what's interesting from a book standpoint is that Lindbergh knew that if he made it, he was going to be incredibly famous. Maybe not as famous as he actually turned out to be, which was literally the most famous person ever in American history at that point in time. Probably the most famous American in the world at that point in time. But he had pre-planned with a publisher, George Putnam, of Putnam and Sons, to write his memoir and story and have it ready to go. And one of the great publishing stories is that Putnam hired a ghostwriter to sort of write the whole autobiography. He called it We. Lindbergh had no idea that they were going to go with that title, but the reference We was a reference to Lindbergh and his plane. It wasn't really a reference to anything else. And it was published in July of 1927, very soon after Lindbergh had made his transatlantic flight at the end of May. For that book, Putnam developed a new strategy, which was the Celebrity Limited Signed Edition, which is something that we do very, very well at the Scholar now, but not something which was known for then. And do you know what he charged per book for his limited edition celebrity signed copies of We? $25 versus the cover price of $2.50 for the regular book, which was already expensive. So imagine that. That would be like a $700 or $800 book, a signed limited edition today. That was the Roaring '20s, so maybe money wasn't as much of an object, but they all sold out pre-publication. The only problem with We is that Lindbergh didn't write it and didn't really like it very much, and it was written in the first person. And so later in life, Lindbergh himself decided to write his own version, which was The Spirit of St. Louis. That's the book that came into the Scholar. And look what we have, Olivia. We have a presentation edition. He copied this. Now, this is published later, but come look at the title page. The Spirit of St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh. This is from 1953, and this is one of the few that were signed and presented, copying on the success of the signed limited editions of We. Just to give you a little flavor of these books, Lindbergh, for the first time in this autobiography, describes the flight from his perspective and talks about how he was convinced that at one point he was going to crash into the Atlantic Ocean and end up very similarly to Rickenbacker. Here's just a little segment here. It would be awfully difficult to work down there with waves breaking over the fuselage and whipped by a gale of wind. The cockpit would probably fill up with water a few seconds after I landed. I might have to hold my breath until I could crawl out through the door and up to the top of the plane. Then I'd have to cut through the roof. of the fuselage to get to the raft and hang on to something while I pumped it up. After that, there'd be the protection. The problem of getting my equipment unlashed from the steel tubes underwater and then getting it lashed again inside the raft. Suppose I could get the raft. Well, this is what was going through Charles Lindbergh's mind in those final hours as he was desperately trying to get across the Atlantic Ocean. That's a great book. We also have this little pamphlet that I found recently at a library sale. This is what was published in France upon the completion of Lindbergh's flight. He was mobbed by thousands of people when he did eventually land. They cut up the airplane, searching for souvenirs. Here, come zoom in on this, but I definitely enjoy the fact that you can see how simple the components of this airplane were. It was not like a cockpit today, was it? And although you can now see the Spirit of St. Louis at the National Aerospace Museum in D.C., a lot of the original plane was actually cut off and hauled away by treasure hunters and souvenir seekers at the time. So Lindbergh's fate during World War II, unfortunately, quite different from that of Rickenbacker's. Lindbergh quite famously opposed American intervention. After Pearl Harbor, he did sort of apologize for that mistake and tried to get behind the war effort, but he was not utilized by Roosevelt, who really held that against him. He's also famous because of a very famous, well-publicized kidnapping case. Are you familiar with this, Olivia? But his one-year-old son was kidnapped, killed, and held for ransom. It was a really tragic event that happened in his life. From a book standpoint, though, he not only wrote these incredible best-selling books. By the way, we sold 650,000 copies immediately after it was published. Right then in July within the first year, which is a huge number. It made Lindbergh over $250,000, so he was well set for the rest of his life. But you know what his real passion was? His real passion, besides aviation, was mechanical engineering. And we actually have the most rare of all Lindbergh books, which is a book that Lindbergh wrote as a scholarly book with a very famous doctor, in which they together worked on inventing the first ever artificial heart. This is true. I bet you didn't know about this Lindbergh book. It is called The Culture of Organs. That is R. Charles Lindbergh, and that is Alexis Carrel, the very famous doctor. And this is an example of what they called the Lindbergh pump, which was, can you imagine? But one of the original efforts to create an artificial heart that would help people who were suffering from other types of disease, heart disease, etc. This is the hardest to find of all the Lindbergh books, and is even more valuable than the signed presentation editions, which were actually fairly common. Lindbergh and the Culture of Organs. Okay, we're going to end with a funny book. I couldn't think of a better funny book than this one. I recently flew on a plane. Olivia, when was the last time you were on a plane?
January.
All right. Well, we went to Chicago, and I was amazed by the safety cards on the planes today. But they're actually, in some ways, even more amusing than this book, which is Designed for Impact, 50 Years of Airline Safety Cards. That's all this book is it reproduces some of the great safety cards in the history of aviation. What I like about the early safety cards is, it's changed a lot, right? They don't look like that anymore. No mermaids, no smiling, that's just the beginning of it. Here's another example of some of the, that looks pretty good. That looks actually sheltered from the sun and everything like that. Also, all the gendered stereotypes, boy, on the early cards or something. You have the male cards and the female cards. Here are the, here's how women do it. Here's how men do it. It's pretty neat. One of the things about the current cards that really surprised me was the way you're supposed to hold your young child. Sort of, you're supposed to crouch over and hold the child up. I encourage you to study Design for Impact. And if you want to know the history of airline safety cards, well, pick up this book for just a small amount and check out at Midtown Scholar. Well, thus ends another Buy Day Friday. Thanks for watching. I'm off to find more treasures at library sales this week, so who knows what we'll have next Friday. Thanks for watching. Please watch next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the